Got dreams of being a professional podcaster, but have no idea what you're doing?
This is impossible.
That's about to change.
A new kind of school.
Welcome to the Pod School Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the show. Today it's all about a little shout out to Google Podcasts for finally stepping up with a way for us to submit a podcast. When you launch a podcast, it used to be mildly frustrating, a little bit more than mildly, I would say, because for most of the podcast platforms, you could just copy and paste the old RSS feed, drop it in there and say to platforms like Apple Podcasts and Spotify, yoo-hoo, I have a show. And you would then get an email coming back to you after that show was finally in the app saying, hey, it's in the app, you can find it. With Google, you just had to wait until they found you. So patience was important. And some of the things that you could do to sort of speed up the process of being found a little faster were actually quite codey for most. And if you kind of look at symbols and numbers and brackets and things and go, not for me, it could be a little bit daunting. So you felt when you were launching a show like things were out of your hands, which is never a good feeling when you are launching and you really want to tell people that your podcast is everywhere. It also used to take a heck of a lot of time. I've waited up to 3 weeks before for shows to turn up in Google Podcasts. And when it's so important for your show to be available on all phones and all devices, so Android in particular, obviously Apple Podcasts is still a major player in the game and a lot of people listen that way, but you want your show to be available on Android. Of course, if people listen to Spotify, that is available on Android phones as well, but Google Podcasts is a really important app for Android listeners. So when you're waiting for your show to turn up in places, it could be a bit of a frustrating wait. But now the process is a lot simpler, and while the times for your show to actually turn up in the app can vary, it appears that it might be a little bit quicker than the old 3 weeks. But again, it's a good idea to still have a few weeks up your sleeve when you're launching a podcast anyway. What happens now is that you go through a similar process like you do with Apple Podcasts and Spotify, where you will submit your show to Google Podcast Manager. I've got a link to that in the show notes of this episode. Basically, what you're doing is claiming your RSS feed. So you're saying, I own this podcast. You have to enter the RSS feed and then a verification code that they send to your email address to make sure that you're not trying to steal the numbers of anybody else. And then not only does it say that it is sending your podcast to Google's index, but it also gives you access to Google Podcast consumption data and stats. James Cridlin, who runs a podcasting newsletter called Pod News, which is great, you should check it out. He ran an experiment actually creating a new podcast that wouldn't have been found by Google before. He submitted it through this process, and in about 5 days, the show turned up, which is way quicker than any show that I've ever had turn up in Google Podcasts by the original method. So this is really exciting if that's going to speed up that process. The other reason that this is great is because of your access to those Google Podcast specific statistics. So this will give you data on people that are listening via Google Podcasts app, the desktop app, and also via Google Home. And the reason that you want to have a look at this data, and you want to do the same on Spotify and Apple Podcasts as well, is it's just great to get an understanding of the behavior of your listeners on different platforms. There's also quite good consumption data, which actually measures how long people are listening to your show. That can give you good insights into whether your show is too long, whether people are bowing out at a point consistently in the same spot in your episode. Maybe you've got something there that you could change up in your content. It can just help you get a better understanding of how people are consuming the podcast content that you're shipping out every week. And the more understanding you have of your audience, really the better you can make your content. So all of this is just great news for podcasting. It helps you feel like you've got a little bit more control at launch phase so that you can know, look, I've submitted my show to Google. I've done all I can do, rather than sitting there twiddling your thumbs thinking, good Lord, just find me already. And it also gives you access to podcast statistics, which is great. One thing to note actually on that podcast statistics point is that Google Podcasts at the moment measures a listen as 5 seconds of somebody listening to your show. That is much lower than the IAB measurement, which is what most podcast hosts should be adhering to. So there's every chance that in Google Podcasts, you might think that you've got more plays on Google Podcasts than your podcast host reports. Don't write any angry letters. It is just very likely that Google is over-reporting your numbers because the industry standard is that to register as a play or a download, you need to have listened to a full 60 seconds of that track. So that is definitely much higher than Google is registering. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at your stats, and give a little high five to Google for finally coming to the party with a platform that we can submit our shows to. Thanks so much for listening. If you are looking for a little help to get your podcast off the ground, my online podcasting course, Pod School, is currently open for enrollment. You can jump right into the course and get started at podschool.com.au. I would love to help you to create a kick-ass show that is high quality and stands the test of time. Not one of these ones that just pod fades out into oblivion. So come and check it out. I'll see you next week. And until then, happy podcasting.
That's all for today.